Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill today. And it is Eastern Front week. And regular viewers will know to expect a fantastic, fact-filled session with my guest, Stephen Zaloga. He is a prolific author, including an excellent Osprey book in the links below on this subject of today's show, which is the tanks in Operation Bagration. So I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Steve. How are you today?
Doing quite well. Nice and hot in Maryland.
So we had a nice discussion there about the fact that Bagration perhaps isn't the most discussed of the Soviet victories in World War II, maybe less than Barbarossa and Kursk and things like that. But it's a fascinating one in terms of armored vehicles. I was surprised by some of the facts that you laid bare in your presentation, which we'll show in a minute. But do you think it's you said to me, do you think it's kind of underappreciated a little bit?
I think it's underappreciated in the West, especially, but even in Russia, there aren't as many detailed, in-depth studies of Bagration as there are some of the other campaigns. Kursk, the battle for Berlin, Barbarossa. So maybe in the future we'll see more. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Well, over to you. And folks, far away with questions, but we'll try and keep this one to an hour because obviously there's football later on that some of us have an invested interest in. But over to Steve to take us through this.
Okay, we can jump to the next slide. One of the first points I'm going to make is that the slide presentation is very heavily focused on numerical charts. Don't worry about that. If you can't read them, all of those charts, or maybe with the exception of one or two, are in the book. And I'm actually putting up the charts to make bigger points. Right. You can go ahead and read the little numbers, but I'm really putting them up for specific points, not for you to have to try to digest all of those numbers. So let's jump into the strategic picture. This map is just to put Bagration in a little bit of perspective. If you look at the map there, the yellow sort of on the right-hand side are the operations in the autumn, winter 1943-44. Basically, the fight for the left bank of Ukraine, the campaigns that took place after the German Kursk offensive was crushed. What happens in the later part of the autumn, the early part of the winter 1943, is the Red Army pushes into right bank Ukraine, the western part of Ukraine. You can see that in the orange section in the lower center. And also the Red Army presses in the north to break the siege of Leningrad and also to start pushing down towards the Baltic states. So the situation in the spring of 1944, just at the outset of Operation Bagration, is that Belarus, which is up above the orange area there, it's sometimes called the Belarusian balcony in the sense that the Russian front is further east than the Ukrainian front. The Red Army had far more success in pushing the Germans back in right bank Ukraine in late 43, early 44. So the situation in the spring of 1944 is, where is the Red Army going to strike? Berlin obviously understands that the Russians have retained the strategic initiative. They did through the winter and spring of 1944. So the issue is, where are they going to hit? Are they going to hit against Army Group Center in Belarus, or are they going to hit against Army Group North Ukraine and South Ukraine in the Ukraine? And the consensus in Berlin is that they're going to continue the offensives out of Ukraine and push out towards the center of the front and not through Belarus. And this is partly for strategic reasons. They believe that there's strategic advantages for the Red Army to operate there. And secondly, the Russians, or the Soviet Union, conducts a number of deception operations to convince the Wehrmacht that they are going to attack out of North Ukraine or towards Army Group North Ukraine rather than out of Belarus. But in fact, of course, they are planning Bagration as an offensive coming out of Belarus. And I might add that this is actually the first of a series of cascading offensives. This whole operation is somewhat equivalent. It's sort of the Soviet equivalent of Overlord. So it starts in the far north. The first campaign will be against Finland, the aim being to knock Finland out of the war. And then that starts at the beginning of June 1944. And then the second phase is Operation Bagration, which starts on the 22nd and 23rd of June. So we can jump to the next slide. I'm not going to try to go into this in any detail. This is the standard Soviet-era map of Bagration. It gives you a general sense of the conduct of the offensive and the major forces. I did a history of Bagration quite a few years ago, almost 30 years ago, in the Osprey campaign series. So if anyone wants a real short account of Bagration, that's available. There are, of course, several other very good histories of Bagration. There's the Soviet General Staff study has been translated on at least 2 occasions into English, so that's available. So I'm not going to go into much detail on the campaign itself. I know that Prit Botar is also going to be giving a talk, so I'm sure he's going to be covering those issues. So I'm going to try to concentrate instead mostly on the issue of the tanks and armored forces used during Bagration. So I'm going to start on the German side. And the big point that I want to make here with these charts is uh, the, uh, the transition from 1943 to 44 is a big issue with the Wehrmacht as far as Panzer strength is concerned. The Germans are anticipating an Allied operation in France in the summer of 1944, and they have to come to grips with the fact that they have to start balancing out the tank force. And so from roughly December 1943 through June 1944, they changed the balance of forces between East and West. If you look at the lower chart, the yellow column there, July 1943, you can see that of the roughly 2,000 tanks that the Wehrmacht has operational in July 1943, 12,000 or roughly 65% are in the East. Very small fraction, only about 400 tanks are in the West, and most of that is down in Italy. And then roughly 350 are in the homeland. That, of course, is for reconstructing old units and building new units. But now, if you start to look at May 1944, the second column in the lower chart, you'll notice that in the West, there are now more Panzers, operational Panzers, than there are in the East. There's 16,000, roughly a half of the Panzer force, whereas there's only 1,000 Panzers operational on the Eastern Front in May. And that figure continues in favor of the Western Front in June. You can see that Panzer strength in the West is up to almost 18,000, whereas the German tank strength on the Eastern Front is now only about 12,000. There's other changes that happen. One of the changes is the mixture of forces on the Eastern Front changes in favor of Stugs, assault guns, and Panzerjäger as compared to Panzers. You'll notice that in the East, less than half the force is Panzers. Almost half the force is Stugs and Panzerjägers, actually a little bit more than half the force. Now, if you compare that to the West, it's interesting because in the West, almost 70% of the German armor force in the West, in Normandy, are Panzers. Only about 20% are Stugs, and only about 10% are Panzerjägers. And that's partly because in the East, it's become largely a defensive battle, and so the balance has shifted in favor of assault guns. And if you look at the figures in the lower chart going through the summer, the West continues to have the balance of the Panzer forces, although it starts to change in August and September once the Soviet offensives start. So let's jump to the next one. The other change is the nature of the Panzer divisions that are left in the East. Practically all, with the exception of 2 of the Waffen-SS Panzer divisions, get shifted from the Eastern Front to the West. And several of the better quality Wehrmacht units, such as Panzer Lehr Division, also get sent to the West. This is a photo of Panzer Lehr in Hungary in the spring of 1944. But by the summer of 1944, they've been moved west, as have most of the experienced Waffen-SS divisions. So you see 1st SS Panzer, 2nd SS Panzer, as well as newer SS Panzer divisions, the 10th, the 9th, the 10th, the 12th. So there's also a shift in those divisions. And I know there's a lot of controversy as to whether these are elite units, but the Waffen-SS Panzer divisions tend to be somewhat better equipped than the regular Heer Panzer divisions. So that's another big change that takes place at this particular point in time. Okay, the next one. Another point that I'd like to make, especially since a lot of you folks have probably been watching the shows in this channel dealing with Normandy. One of the big differences, East and West, is the density of armored forces between the 2 fronts. There's a lot of controversy over the performance of British armor in Normandy compared to whether it's the Red Army or the U.S. Army, whoever. people have never bothered to take a look at the force density differences between the East and the West. And I've shown on this graph, if you look at the chart up at the top, British Second Army during the fighting around Caen in mid-June, the frontage is relatively small. It's only about 20 miles. And the density, the density of German AFVs, by AFVs I mean tanks, Stugs, and Panzerjäger, there's almost 34 tanks and AFVs, German tanks and AFVs in the frontage. So if you view it as a ratio between that and the particular campaign I'm going to be talking about here, the 4 Soviet fronts during Operation Bagration, the ratio is roughly 2 German tanks AFVs on the Eastern Front, on the Bagration front, versus about 32 in the Caen sector. The difference is about the density of German panzers facing the Allies in the Caen sector is about 16 times higher than it was at Bagration, which is one reason that the British Army had so much difficulty in the Caen sector. And I've shown some other examples here, even in the U.S. sector for Cobra, which, and the U.S. sector didn't have very heavy concentrations of German panzers because it was bocage country that's not really very suitable for tank operations. But even there, the density was much, much higher in the U.S. sector. The only sector that comes close is the Army Group North Ukraine. And that was because, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Wehrmacht expected that the Soviet summer offensive was going to start against Army Group North Ukraine. And so not surprisingly, the heaviest concentration of the Panzer force was in North Ukraine. And you can see that the ratio there, the density there is somewhat closer to what's in the West against the U.S. Army, not against the British Army. It's still significantly lower. Okay, let's try jumping to the next one. I'm just talking tank types. There's no big change between the summer battles at Kursk and the summer battles in 1944 in the broad sense. Heeresgruppe Mitte, Army Group Center, still relied on the Panzer IV as their principal battle tank, and it's still the 75 millimeter L48 armed guns. It's mostly by this stage Ausführung H's and Ausführung J's, but still it's heavily based on the Panzer IV. It's worth mentioning that in the Bagration sector, at least at the start of the campaign, there are no Panther tanks. All of the Panthers are on other fronts, mainly North Ukraine. Some Panthers will be moved into Belarus after the campaign starts, but at the start of the campaign, there's no Panthers in Belarus. If we can jump to the next one. This chart is going to be very, very hard to read, and I don't really expect that the viewers will try to read it. But I can just make a couple of simple points. If you look at the little yellow lines, those show the 4 army groups. Starting in the upper left, it's Army Group North, then Army Group Center, which is the army group we're dealing with here in this talk. And then in the upper right, it's Army Group North Ukraine, and then Army Group South. You can see simply by the number of panzer divisions and panzer units that the forces in the Ukraine, both North Ukraine and South, are substantially larger than what's on the Northern Front. Both Army Group North, which is aimed at protecting the Baltic, and Army Group Center, which is aimed at protecting Belarus. You can see at how much smaller the force is there compared to what's sitting down facing the Ukrainian fronts. So if we can jump to the next
just
one.
a quick question from Jim, but it is a potential massive rabbit hole, but it might be just to do a concise comparison. Was there a difference in the number of armored fighting vehicles per platoon, company, battalion, division, vastly different between Western Allies and Soviets? I mean, this is one of the things that when you're trying to explain this stuff, you're an armored division, an American armored division is not quite the same as the British armored division, is definitely not the same as the German or Soviet, but is there kind of a ballpark comparison you can quite quickly summarize?
I'll tell you what, let's wait until I get to the Soviets, because
Okay.
I can mention something about the Germans, but I'd rather mention the Soviets. I've got a chart coming up on the Soviet side that shows their basic formations, and it's easier to explain the Soviets with that chart up.
Okay.
But on the German side, the important thing to remember is the difference between the German tables of organizations, the KSTNs, versus actual strength. And I've got a chart coming up in a couple of minutes to show you how deep the shortfalls were. So it's kind of pointless to compare like platoon strength or company strength or battalion strength just on paper tables of organization. The reason being that the Germans are traditionally much weaker if you compare the actual paper strength versus actual strength. The U.S. Army and the British Army both fight very close to paper strength, their TO&Es, whereas the German Army especially fights at only a fraction of their TOE or the KSTN strength. This chart is a simple one. Stug units were the backbone of Army Group Center. The top chart shows Stug brigades on the Russian front. And here's a good example of the difficulty of dealing with organization terms between the German army and the Western armies. Stug brigades are really not brigades. They're battalions. They're really not very large. When they did the organizational change to Abteilung in 1943, they came up with this term, but they're really not. Don't think of these brigades as being, large, 70 or 80 or 90 Stugs. They are not. They're relatively modest. They're more like the size of a U.S. tank battalion or maybe a British tank regiment, and not even that strong. My bigger point here is if you take a look at the second chart, the lower chart, and you look at Heeresgruppe Mitte, Army Group Center, there's 13 Stug brigades there, 352 Stugs. That's one of the significant differences between that front, the Belarusian front, versus the other fronts. You'll notice that there's almost twice as many Stugs on the center front versus the North Ukraine front. And that's partly because the Wehrmacht was expecting to fight a defensive battle in Belarus, and the Stug was the quintessential defensive weapon for the German army at this point in the war. We can jump ahead one. Mentioning once again the operational strength versus the paper strength. And these are the shortfalls of tanks and AFVs on the Russian front at various points in time, 1st of June, before this campaign starts and right through the summer. There's an enormous shortfall of tanks and armored vehicles on the Eastern Front at the start of this campaign, meaning that you can't rely on simply looking at divisional strength. You might see 10 Panzer divisions in North Ukraine, but there's not 10 Panzer divisions worth of strength. The other point to keep in mind is one of the significant differences between the German Panzer Division of 1944 and the German Panzer Division earlier in the war, or for that matter, say the U.S. Armored Division, is that the German Panzer Division of 1944 is much more defensively organized. It has 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments. And, so if you go and compare that to, say, the U.S. Armored Division, U.S. Armored Division has 3 armored infantry battalions. So roughly half of the infantry strength that a 1944 Panzer Division has. Well, the reason for that much larger infantry complement within the Panzer Division is the orientation of the Panzer Division in 1944 is heavily defensive. So a German Panzer Division will have only a fraction of the tanks, maybe about half the number of tanks that an American armored division has. But on the other hand, they'll have about twice as much infantry. And it's harder to compare Russian and German units or Soviet and German units at this point. And I'll explain that when we get into Soviet units in a moment, because the organizational terms differ quite a bit. And so, if you go down, let's jump ahead to the next chart. The next chart is another important chart, and it's one that's really important to keep in mind when you're dealing with the Panzer Force in the East. And that is overall strength versus operational strength. And the reason is that the Germans count their tank strength in some very odd ways. And it's odd in terms of both strength and losses. And I'm starting here with strength. The Germans count strength in at least 3 different columns. They have what's called operational strength, which is tanks that are running on a given day. And they have 2 other categories, short-term repair and long-term repair. Short-term repair is nominally tanks that are available or should be available within 24 hours, meaning that they've suffered some kind of damage, whether it's mechanical damage or combat damage, but they should be available short-term. Then there's long-term damage, and those are practically all vehicles that have suffered battlefield damage and will probably eventually be shipped back to Germany. And then there's the category total losses. But the German definition of total losses are literally tanks that are unrecoverable. And typically it's tanks that have been completely burned out or tanks that are in enemy hands. And that differs from a lot of other armies. For example, both the Red Army and the US Army, and to a large extent the British Army, when they say they suffered X number of tank losses during a particular battle or during a campaign, they generally mean both total unredeemable losses and losses where the tanks are not recoverable within a few days. And so the Germans that tends to lead the German figures to be something of an underestimation of the number of losses that they've suffered. And they also have a problem in that they don't come to grips with those other categories, that short-term out of service and long-term out of service during the course of the campaign. There's oftentimes a tally at the end of the campaign to kind of make up for that. That's especially the case in Normandy. If you look at German tank loss in Normandy, the losses in June, July, August seem to be quite low. And then suddenly in September, there's these massive German tank losses. Well, obviously, they didn't occur in September 1944 because aside from the tank battles down in Lorraine, there aren't that many big tank battles. The September losses were losses in Normandy in June, July, and August that get tallied up for other reasons in September. But now the chart here shows the other category, operational tank strength. And in April 1944, the Wehrmacht starts adopting a policy where they tell units to stop reporting all those other categories. The higher commands don't care about short-term losses. They don't care about long-term repair. They don't care about losses. All they care about is operational tanks. How many tanks do you have on hand? What's operational for tomorrow's operation? And so starting roughly in the late spring, early summer 1944, you start to see the tendency of the German army to only report operational tank strength and to ignore those other categories. But now if you start looking at operational tank strength through time, some interesting observations can be made. And where these numbers come from is the quartermaster of the General Inspector of the Panzer Force. The head of the General Inspector of the Panzer Force this time was Heinz Guderian. But you'll notice that German operational readiness rates tend to be very, very high in the summer during the campaign season. Then they go down lower in the winter. And that's not only in this case because on the East Front there were continued offensives during the winter, and so there were continuing losses during the fall and winter of 1943-44. But there's other underlying reasons. And one of the reasons is that the Wehrmacht has some very distinct policies as far as resupply of new tanks is concerned, and most importantly, resupply of spare parts. What tended to happen in the Army, and this also extends back in time, if you went back and looked at 1942 and 1943, you'd notice the same trend. The strength figures tend to be very high in the summer of 42, in the summer of 43, summer 44, because the German Army builds up its forces to launch the summer campaigns. And that's both in terms of new tanks being made available to the divisions already stationed on the front, and it also means a big influx of spare parts so that all those tanks that are sidelined because they're lacking functional transmissions or engines or whatever, that stuff starts to flow in. And as a result, the Panzer divisions on whatever front are able to build up their strength again. And so you see it here. This chart is also useful for showing the relative reliability rates of the various armored vehicle types. The Tiger, which is that orange line, traditionally was a maintenance problem. It's a very complicated, heavy vehicle. It tended to suffer higher breakdown rates than other tanks. The Panther in its early days, especially the Panther Ausführung D in the summer of 1943, had very bad reliability rates until the Ausführung A starts appearing in the early part of 44. So you see a very dramatic change with Panther. It goes from being pretty awful through the winter of 43, but by the summer of 44, it's quite good. Arguably, the Panther Ausführung A is the most reliable and probably the best of the Panther variants. The Panther starts to suffer again with the Aus G, which is another cheapened version of the Panther. And then Panzer IV is better than the heavier tanks, but it's still not spectacularly reliable. But the best performer of all is the Stug 3. It was just a very dependable vehicle, relatively easy to maintain. The chassis wasn't overstressed, so it keeps pretty high reliability rates even during the grim winter months. You can see that it's keeping over half of the vehicles are operational at any one time. And before the start of the campaign, it's up in the high 80s as far as reliability is concerned. So that's another factor to keep in mind when you're looking at German tank strength. It's not only the actual strength; it's the more critical factor is the operational strength. How many of these tanks are actually ready for combat the next day after the reports come in?
So just for clarification, a couple of people asking about when your column that says Stug there, that is all Stugs. That's not including Marders or anything else, waifs and strays.
Right, that's only Stugs. That's only the assault guns, and that's only Stug 3 and Stug 4. It's by and large, it's mostly Stug 3s. There certainly were some Stug 4 units on the Eastern Front, but it's by and large, it's Stug 3s. This is not Panzerjägers. I did put the Panzerjäger strength in this particular chart.
Okay.
This chart comes from the General Inspector of the Panzer Force, and so the Stugs that are listed here are actually Stugs that are under control of the Panzer Force. You have to keep in mind that Stugs were in two different locations. There were Stugs, especially in Panzer Grenadier divisions. The Panzer Regiment and the Panzer Grenadier division was typically equipped with Stugs, and there were Stugs elsewhere within the Panzer units. Then on top of it, the German artillery branch was responsible for the separate assault gun units, and so there was that dichotomy in Stug units.
And this is where you get that whole complication of tank destroyers and assault guns and what is what, and and it changes within even a nation, let alone across the various nations. And we did our tank destroyer week, and famously at the end of it, we were more confused about what a tank destroyer was than when we started, because it is all subject to doctrine, use, who they're being used by, defensive or offensive, and there are so many variables.
Well, one of the only easy things you can say is that the German infantry divisions have no tanks. They're by and large a German infantry formation. An infantry division will have no tanks. Yeah. It gets complicated when you go to corps level, because theoretically corps might have a Tiger battalion, at least temporarily attached to it. The German infantry divisions had Stugs and Panzerjägers, so that makes it a little bit easier on the German side, but it's still messy, because, as you probably know, there was a big debate between the Panzer Force, especially Heinz Guderian, and the infantry officers about the allocation of Stugs. Who gets them? And the Panzer Force kept taking over more and more Stugs. Stugs originally began as an infantry weapon. They were raised by the artillery force, but they're basically an infantry support weapon. But as the war went on, the General Inspector of the Panzer troops took over more and more Stugs for the Panzer Grenadier divisions and for the Panzer divisions. So that gets messy, and it gets especially messy when you talk about the Hetzer, the Panzerjäger 38. Well, the Panzerjäger 38 started out as a Stug. It started out as an assault gun, and then, because Guderian at the time was the head of the General Inspector of the Panzerwaffe, he decided to label it as a Panzerjäger because he didn't like Stugs. So there's all sorts of crazy politics involved. Okay, we can jump to the next one.
Yeah.
New types entering service summer 1944. As I mentioned, the bulk of the German Panzer Force during Bagration is pretty much the same old, same old. Two of the innovations that pop up in the summer 1944 are the Tiger II, sometimes called Royal Tiger, King Tiger. A battalion of these show up in August 1944 in Poland. They're not available at the start of the campaign. The first battalion shows up in early August. They get unloaded at a Polish rail yard and sent into action against one of the Ukrainian fronts. They are actually sent in to try to defend one of the Vistula River bridgeheads, and they mostly break down. The battalion breaks down on the course of moving down to the bridgehead, and then of the handful of Tiger IIs that get down to the bridgehead, they get ambushed by T-34-85s. And if you look at the cover art on my Osprey book, that's the battle between Oskin's T-34-85 and those handful of Tiger IIs. The other new vehicle that shows up is what most people call the Hetzer, what officially is called the Panzer 38. This was an attempt to use the two Panzer factories in the Czech provinces for a more effective fighting vehicle. Those two plants had been originally used for production of the Panzer 38T, the light tank. Obviously, by 1942, that's obsolete. So production starts to shift over towards the use of the 38T chassis for Panzerjägers. So you have the Marder 3 series, which uses mostly the PaK 40 75 millimeter gun on them. By 1944, there's an effort to develop a fully armed Panzerjäger. As I mentioned, it was actually originally started as a Stug, as a cheap alternative to the Stug 3. The German infantry force is demanding more and more Stug 3s. There's not enough production capacity, so the idea is we'll take the Panzer 38T and convert it into a Stug, and that's done by sticking a 75 millimeter gun on it. But as I mentioned, by this stage, Guderian is head of the Panzerwaffe, and he insists on calling the vehicle the Panzer 38. But it was in fact used primarily as a Stug. If you go and you look at where these things end up, they're generally in the Panzerjäger companies of infantry divisions. So they're serving in basically the same role that the Stug 3 would be serving in infantry divisions. You don't typically see them in the independent Stug units like the Stugger brigades, although occasionally you do see them there because by the summer, fall of 1944, the Wehrmacht is so desperate, you see all sorts of equipment and all sorts of strange formations. But these start to show up, the Hetzers start to show up in the roughly July, August 1944. Okay, I'm not going to describe all of the battles in Bagration. I can't, and that's way outside the scope of this thing. But what I am going to do at least is show the casualties. Once again, these figures should not be taken at face value. These are the figures from the Heereswaffenamt. So the general numbers are probably pretty decent, but they can't be taken entirely at face value. But they give some sense of the relative losses through time. You can see extremely heavy losses in July due to the defeat of Army Group Center during Operation Bagration, but heavy losses once again in August. Now the front really comes down in August when the northern fronts, meaning the Soviet Belarusian fronts, the Baltic front, and then the fighting tends to get concentrated further south in Romania and Hungary. So you can see the German casualties really start to level off in August and September. The heavy casualties occur in July and August. But to give you some sense of the difficulty of working with these numbers, if you look at the Tiger II figures for this chart, you'll see that there's no Tiger IIs listed as having been knocked out. Well, the Russians captured three in August 1944, absolutely positively. One of them is currently sitting in Kubinka in Russia. So these numbers shouldn't be taken as the gospel truth, but they at least give some sense of the relative scale of the losses that were suffered by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front during the summer 1944 campaigns. Okay, jumping over to the Red Army, to the Soviet side. T-34-85, which sees its debut in 1944, and we can jump to the next slide. Okay, Soviet tank units. There was the question a little while ago about how Russian units compared to Allied units or to Wehrmacht units. Here's all of the different flavors of Soviet units, and I'll give descriptions of some of the bigger, the more significant ones, because they can be confusing. So the first two columns there, the ones headed by TK and MK. TK is Tankowy Korpus, or Tank Corps. Now, when you hear the word Tank Corps, you immediately think Panzer Corps or an armored corps in the Western sense. They are not that. A Soviet Tank Corps or Soviet Mechanized Corps, think armored division or mechanized division. They are not corps-sized formations in the Western sense. They are divisional size formations. They have in the number of 200 tanks. They have roughly somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 troops, depending on how strong they are, how close they are to their Stadt, the Stadt being the Soviet equivalent of TONEs. So those are the two big Soviet armored formations. And you can see in the case of the units that are involved in Mida or in the fighting for Bagration, you can see the units committed there. And I'll deal with that in a moment. Now, the next important unit in the Red Army are the independent tank brigades. That's the third column there. Independent tank brigades are the units that are assigned generally with rifle corps, and that's basically the tank support that's put in charge or put under the control of rifle corps. Now, the reason is that Soviet rifle units don't have much in the way of organic armor, so there's a variety of these so-called independent units, units that are then attached at corps level. The next column there, OTP, is the independent tank regiment. Those are slightly smaller than brigades. Same thing, those are used to reinforce rifle corps during offensive operations. The next one, the SA, is for self-propelled artillery, and you have the same flavor here. You have brigades and regiments. So you have self-propelled artillery brigades and you have self-propelled artillery regiments. Now, the point here is that the self-propelled artillery brigades are fairly small in number at this stage of the campaign. It's mostly the regiments. And these include a wide range of different type of self-propelled artillery. They include, the really common one are the Su-76, the little light assault guns, which are sort of the Soviet equivalent of the Stug 3. Those are common as dirt. That's a very common type of unit. It includes the units that have really more of a tank destroyer role, the ones that are equipped with the Su-85 with an 85 millimeter gun. And they also include the heavy regiments, which are equipped with ISU 122s and 152s. The next column are a very rare unit, which are the separate armored car battalions. Super duper rare, mostly found up on the Leningrad front because Leningrad was isolated for so long during the war. The Red Army has very few of these units at the time. And then finally, there's about 40 armored trains. Armored trains are really a unit. They fight almost like a little miniature tank battalion. They don't tend to fight right up along the front of the lines. They tend to be used for rear area security, but they are sometimes used in an offensive role. So I listed those here, and those are part of the Soviet armored force. And that shows the number at the front. There are more of these units in reserve and in the rear, but this is the actual frontal strength as of the 1st of July, 1944.
Thank you.
Okay, here's what's actually assigned to Bagration. There's one tank army, that's Rotmistrov's tank army with the 3rd Belarusian Front. There are 6 tank corps. The 2 very strong fronts are 3rd Belarusian and 1st Belarusian. 1st Belarusian, of course, is Rokossovsky's, and that one is somewhat unusual. 1st Belarusian is located right at the junction between the northern central forces, part of Bagration, and the units down in Ukraine. So not all 1st Belarusian front units are committed to Bagration. A portion of their units are held back. Now, the reason for this, and anybody who's studied anything about the Eastern Front knows, there's a geographical reason for this. Smack dab along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border is the Pripyat marshes. And so that's a barrier to mechanized operations. And so that tends to act as a dividing line in mechanized operations, whether it's 1941 or 1944. So the 1st Belarusian Front stuff that's up on sort of the northern edge of the Pripyat tended to be committed to Bagration. The ones south were held up for the next phase, which is the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive. And you'll also notice here that there's cavalry corps, which you might not think of in terms of armored units, but the Red Army traditionally mixed cavalry corps with mechanized units. And the reason is that cavalry corps and cavalry divisions were extremely effective in that central area between Belarus and Ukraine and the Pripyat marsh area. Those marshlands were not particularly useful, the terrain was difficult for use by mechanized units, whereas the cavalry units could be used quite effectively within those areas. So you'll notice that there's 2 cavalry corps committed to the operation. The chart below gives a sense of the disposition of the forces, comparing the different wings. And the important ones to look at are the Third Belarusian Front. Third Belarusian Front is the front that's going to be coming down on the northern side of Minsk. And going back to geography for a moment, the key geographical feature in Belarus is the highway that goes roughly from Warsaw in Poland up through Białystok, up through the Belarusian capital of Minsk, and then up through Orsha and Smolensk. So if you remember, whether it's the Napoleonic Wars, the 1941 Barbarossa campaign, that's the Smolensk Gap. That's the traditional route between Central Europe and Moscow. Warsaw, Minsk, Smolensk, Moscow. And so Third Belarusian is coming down that highway. It's coming down on the northern side of that highway. So not surprisingly, it has a very heavy armor force. You can see that they have an advantage of almost 6-1 against the Germans in that sector. First Belarusian, which is the other heavy armor force, which is coming up on the south side of that highway, has a slightly smaller armor contingent, but that's because it is operating in the marshier lands down south. And you'll notice also I put some numbers in parentheses. Those are specialized engineering tanks. This is one campaign where the Red Army goes out of their way to use specialized engineer tanks, and those are mine roller tanks and flamethrower tanks. And so I've tried to isolate those numbers to give you a sense of the specialized tanks that are used during Bagration. And we can jump one more chart. The backbone of the Red Army armored force during Bagration is the good old T-34. And the version that's by far the most common in the summer of 1944 is this version. It's sometimes called the Model 43. This version appears in early 1942. It's characterized by that new, larger turret, sometimes called the Geica turret. And this particular type is produced from early part of 42 all the way into 1944, and it's by far the most common T-34 version in the summer of 1943 and well into the summer of 1944. The only change that occurs after the Battle of Kursk, the one sort of lesson learned from Kursk, is the addition of that commander's cupola on some of the later production tanks. You can see the tank commander with his head poked out there. They added a vision cupola there because they realized that the T-34 had a real problem with situational awareness. The commander didn't have adequate vision, so they added this cupola. So a large fraction of the T-34s that see combat in the summer of 1944 have this feature. But they're armed with the same 76 millimeter gun that had been in T-34 use since 1941. There's not a big change in that regard. Armor protection is roughly the same. It's very similar to what would have appeared in 1941. One of the biggest changes is in the autumn of 1943, the main T-34 plant, Earl Vagon Zavod in Nizhny Tagil, they instituted a program to try to improve the reliability of the T-34. Because during 1943, there's roughly 4 plants producing T-34. They try to impose a greater degree of standardization and a greater effort made to improve the reliability so that on average, a T-34 can go 300 kilometers before breaking down. So Soviet tank reliability is not great. You know, there are complaints about German reliability, but the Red Army has real problems all through the war with tank reliability. Now we can jump to the next one. The innovations in the summer of 1944 on the tank side is T-34-85 and the IS-2 heavy tank. T-34-85 is the one big result of the Battle of Kursk. In the summer of 1943, the Red Army's plan was to introduce a new follow-on to the T-34 and the KV called the T-43. It was going to replace both the T-34 and the KV because it was going to have the armor of the KV, the heavier armor of the KV heavy tank, while at the same time being smaller and more maneuverable, just like the T-34. Kursk happens, and of course the Panther shows up, the Tiger shows up. Red Army realizes, no, our problem is not armor or anything like that. Our problem is firepower. We've got to come up with better guns to deal with the heavier German tanks like the Tiger and the Panther. So the immediate solution is to mount the 85 millimeter gun in the T-34. This takes some time to institute, partly because it takes time to crank up 85 millimeter gun production. The picture in the upper left here shows the original version of T-34-85 that had the D5T gun. That's the version of the gun that is basically related to the 85 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. It was not very suitable for tank use. The breech is too big. It's not a tank-oriented gun. So in the early part of 1944, the main Soviet artillery directorate developed the S-53 gun, which has basically the same ballistics as this gun, but it's a gun designed to be fit into the turret of the T-34. And so that enters production roughly February 1944, and that becomes sort of the key T-34-85 for most of the campaign. But in the summer campaigns, there's still not a lot of T-34-85s. In Bagration, there's maybe about 400, 500 involved in the Bagration phase. There's more down with the other fronts. The other big addition is IS-2. IS-2 is the culmination of Red Army dissatisfaction with the KV. The KV was never entirely popular in the Red Army. It had the same gun as the T-34. It had better armor. But by 1942-43, its armor is not that much better than the T-34 to justify its heavy weight and its relative lack of reliability compared to the T-34. So the first stage was an effort made to unify T-34 and KV as the so-called T-43. As I mentioned, that program is canceled after Kursk. Then there's an effort made to lighten the KV called KV-13. But once again, Kursk emphasized the point we need more firepower, not more armor. And so KV-13 eventually evolves into the IS series, the first version being sometimes called the IS-1 or the IS-85. And that's an KV-13, now renamed as IS, equipped with the same 85 millimeter gun as the T-34 or T-34-85. Of course, the Red Army then asked, well, why are we getting a heavy tank with an 85 when our T-34 is going to get the 85? So the Red Army Tank Force responds with a 122 millimeter gun. Now, I might add there were two options with the IS-2, that being the 100 millimeter gun, the D-10T, or the 122 millimeter gun. And the Red Army eventually decides on the 122 millimeter gun, not because of its anti-tank performance. The IS-2 is not a tank fighter. It is not an equivalent of the King Tiger. It's not intended primarily for tank fighting. It's a heavy breakthrough tank. Its main role is to serve in those heavy breakthrough tank regiments that support the rifle corps. So the emphasis there is high explosive firepower. Now, if it's got good firepower against German tanks, great. That's a useful secondary feature. But its main function is firepower for the rifle units. So the Red Army selects the 122. And so IS-2 starts showing up in significant numbers in the summer of 1944. The other vehicle that is very, very numerous in the summer of 1944 is the Su-76M. Su-76 first turned up during the Battle of Kursk in the early version, which basically had a failed interior layout. They had two separated engines and two separated transmissions, leading to real reliability problems. As a result, Su-76 was completely redesigned in the fall of 1943, resulting in the Su-76M, which had two inline engines and so much better reliability. Now, what Su-76 is it's the follow-on to the earlier war Soviet light tanks. The Soviet tank industry was broken into two components, one which is sometimes called the medium machine building industry, which basically builds what we would consider tanks, the T-34, the KV, that sort of thing. The agricultural ministry, the machine industry of the agricultural ministry, was responsible for lighter vehicles, and that would have included earlier in the war the T-60 light tank, T-70 light tank. Those tanks were obsolete really by 1942, but they stayed in production simply because the factories, that's about what they could produce. There was a T-80 built or designed and accepted for service. The Red Army didn't want it. They didn't want any more light tanks. What the Red Army wanted is more firepower from the light tanks. So instead of building light tanks, they decided to build an assault gun using the ZIS-3, which is the standard divisional gun, and mounted on a T-70 chassis. And this sometimes is misunderstood as a Panzerjäger, as a Russian equivalent of the German Panzerjäger. It most certainly is not. The ZIS-3 76 millimeter gun is not an anti-tank gun. It's the divisional gun. It's the equivalent of the British 25 pounder or the US 105 millimeter howitzer or the German 105 millimeter howitzer. It's the standard field artillery piece of the Russian rifle divisions. And so its use on the Su-76 is for high explosive firepower. And this vehicle is designed primarily as the primary fire support vehicle for the Russian rifle divisions. And that's why it's armed with the same weapon as the rifle division's own artillery battalions. So this vehicle becomes very, very commonplace during the summer 1944 campaign. We could go to the next slide. Okay, the actual combat during 1944 from the Soviet perspective. I'm putting up German kill claims here in comparison to Soviet kill claims because there's always a lot of controversy. Oh, okay, the Germans claim all of these tanks knocked out, and what's the real numbers? Well, we're really not certain. There are no good comprehensive month-by-month Soviet tank loss figures, or at least I haven't seen them anywhere. There's some campaign ones. The Krivosheyan book on Soviet human and material casualties does have some loss figures, but they're certainly not month by month. But the numbers up at the top are from Fremdheros, the German Eastern Foreign Armies Intelligence Agency, and that shows the kill claims. The top three lines are the Army, the Luftwaffe, and then subtotaled. So from June to September, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe claimed to have knocked out 12,000 Soviet tanks and AFVs. Now, Fremdheros, when they got those numbers, would apply they would adjust the numbers by dividing it by a particular fraction. So they would tend to discount the Luftwaffe claims much more than the Army claims. So they roughly would cut the Luftwaffe claims in half. And they would, from month to month it differed, but they would typically multiply or divide the Army claims by roughly 1.5. But it varied during time. The FHO numbers, the denominator number that they would use to adjust the kill claims would change through time. So in any event, the bottom line is Fremdheros estimated that Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe knocked out just short of 7,000 Soviet tanks and AFVs in that time frame. Now, if you look at the Russian admitted losses, the losses for particular campaigns are shown here. It's roughly 5,000. There are some smaller campaigns that are not listed here, so that number probably would have gone up to about 6,000. So it's not that wildly off from the FHO numbers, although an important thing to keep in mind is that the German claims are mostly direct fire claims, whether it's guns or Panzerfaust or various Luftwaffe aircraft or bombs. It doesn't include other types of losses caused by mines, obstacles, and that sort of thing. So the German claims are still somewhat exaggerated, even though they do come a little bit closer to Russian admitted losses than you might otherwise expect. And this chart is useful. This is not total numbers. As I say, there are not any good, for example, there is no good set of numbers by Soviet tank formations as to what they suffered during the summer. But some specific tank units, tank armies, did put out some pretty good numbers for the summer fighting. And the best or the most useful information here is the bottom line. What were the causes of Soviet tank and AFV losses during the summer fighting? And as you can see, gunfire losses are by far the largest. 87%, where the Red Army could identify the cause of the losses, 87% were gunfire losses. Now that would mean losses to German tank fire, Stugs, Panzerjäger, but also towed anti-tank guns. The Wehrmacht has a lot of towed anti-tank guns in Army Group Center and in all of the other formations on the East Front. So that was it's a mixture of both tank and anti-tank weapons. Mine losses are significant, around 7%. Luftwaffe losses, bombing attacks, gun-armed Luftwaffe aircraft, relatively small, 6%. The interesting figure here is you'll notice that there's very few Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck losses. And that's because summer 1944, Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck are just getting into service.
Right.
And so the losses in this campaign don't have a lot of losses from those causes. In later campaigns, especially in 1945, you're going to see Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck becoming a very significant fraction of Soviet tank losses. And with that, I think, here's the strategic situation, 23 August. At this point, the Central Front and the Northern Fronts basically come to something of a grinding halt, and the Red Army shifts its emphasis south into Romania and into Hungary. And they're going to be waiting and building up their forces until January 1945 with the Vistula-Oder offensive. But that's, of course, another story.
Indeed. Well, amazing stuff, Steve. So we're coming to the point where some of you folks watching are going to go off and watch the football, but we've got so many questions. Those of us who want to stick around for some questions, we'll do that. So we've been building up great views. So I'll just do them in the random order they've been coming in, Steve. That's okay with you. So Splodge is asking, is Bagration the greatest ever offensive of the Red Army, or do they do it even better elsewhere?
That's hard to say. I mean, I consider Bagration to be the most impressive simply because the relative force ratios weren't as crazy as they might have been, for example, during the Vistula-Oder offensive in the winter of 1944-45, or actually 45. Personally, Bagration is my favorite, partly because I wrote a history of the campaign, but I do think it's a very impressive campaign. It shows the Red Army really coming to maturity. Their use of deception, the relative much higher skill level displayed by all the various Soviet formations, not only the tank force, but the rifle forces, the artillery force. It's just a much better performance than the summer of 1943.
Michael is suggesting Manchuria, possibly.
That's against a force that's only a shadow of what it was. The Japanese army in Manchuria of 1945 is not the Japanese army of 1939 or that sort of thing. So no, I mean, Manchuria is impressive just for the speed of the operation, but it's against, I don't want to call the Japanese army a paper army, but it's not, the Japanese army of 1945 in Manchuria is not the Wehrmacht in Belarus and Ukraine of 1944.
Okay, thank you. Mad Cat is saying, was Army Group Center doomed once its Panzer reserves were withdrawn?
I don't think it was doomed, but it had a much harder time defending itself than it did even in the spring of 1944. David Glantz did an excellent book on the war for Belarus in the spring of 1944. And Army Group Center rebuffs the Red Army attacks through the spring of 1944. It's only in the summer when the Soviets surreptitiously move large tank forces for Bagration and the Wehrmacht loses so many Panzer units to the west that Army Group Center becomes far more vulnerable to a Red Army offensive.
Okay. And this one will be one I'll put to print as well tomorrow. But why were casualties for the Soviets still higher than the Germans at 700,000, despite them destroying the German army? I mean, we talked about this before going live. The myth that the Red Army is a blunt instrument has been partly debunked, but they're still not very sophisticated. So is that kind of what it comes down? They're just not quite good at their combined arms, everything, and they incur heavy casualties.
I would say yes, but I'm reluctant to talk about that in this context. I was dealing mostly with the tank force, and that question should maybe be put to Prit Butar if he's going to be covering the broader aspects of the Red Army. But yeah, certainly in this campaign, also with tank losses, the Red Army continues to suffer disproportionately high tank losses compared to the Wehrmacht at this time. It's not until the 1945 campaigns that Red Army tank losses start to become closer to what Wehrmacht tank losses are. And in fact, Pavel Rotmistrov gets relieved from command after Bagration due to the high tank losses in his tank army. So the Red Army is very upset about these continued high losses, but they're willing to suffer them for the price of victory. They were not happy with the level of tank losses suffered, especially at the tail end of Bagration. The big tank losses that the Russians suffered during Bagration are the August losses when they start facing the reinforced Panzer divisions around Warsaw, when they start getting down to the Vistula River. That's when the really heavy losses start in those August battles. But yeah, there were discrepancies also if you compare German tank losses to Soviet tank losses.
This should be a quick one. How big a part did captured tanks or Panzer play in this engagement?
Hardly any. The Panzers by this stage, the Panzers in the earlier campaigns were mostly French. The largest proportion were French, and by 1944 they were all worn out. And then numerically, the next most important source of Panzer were the Italian tanks that get picked up in September 1943 when Italy changes sides. They don't really show up on the East Front much. They show up in some anti-partisan units, more in Central Europe, like you see them in Austria, you see them in Poland. You'll see them in very small numbers in Belarus for anti-partisan operations. The Wehrmacht never used all that many Russian tanks because they had continual problems with spare parts. So you have some odd things like, there was a German unit with about 25 T-34s during the Battle of Kursk. I think that was 2nd SS Panzer Division. But that's relatively rare. You see onesies and twosies. You see small numbers, but you don't see large formations. You see far more Panzers, for example, in Normandy. I'm sure people are familiar with the pictures in Normandy, especially the Panzerjägers. The Martyr ones on the Lorraine chassis. There's lots of those. But also there's 2 entire Panzer battalions in Normandy, whereas the Panzer battalions that you see on the Eastern Front are generally anti-partisan units. They're not out there fighting in the front lines.
Okay, thank you. And then one from Andrew about radios and communications, because that's something that's often leveled at the Soviets, the Red Army, is that their inability to have communication between their units. I mean, it's something that the Western Allies are getting better at as the war goes on. But, at this point in the war, June 44, have they got communication between infantry and tanks and artillery and other units?
It's old-fashioned, but you have to keep in mind that the same is true of even the U.S. Army has by far the best radios of any army in World War II, period. The U.S. Army's FM radios are better than anybody's. But the U.S. Army in the summer 1944, at the start of the Normandy campaign, has very awkward radio communications between tanks and infantry units. And it's not because of the shortage of radios, it's because the tanks have FM radios and the infantry has AM radios. They're not operating in the same bandwidths. The Russian tank force or the Soviet tank force is a distinctly different problem, and that's the supply of radios, the number of radios that are available, and the durability of radios. The Soviet electronics industry was badly disrupted by Barbarossa, by the loss of radio factories, both in Ukraine and in Western Soviet Union. Belarus, for example, has traditionally been the center of the Soviet electronics industry. So there's shortfalls in radios. And so it's not only the awkwardness that's shared by many armies at this stage of the war, including the German army. It's also just a shortage of equipment. A real problem with infantry tank communication is you need small portable radios. Small portable radios need dry cell batteries. Dry cell batteries are in short supply with most armies, with the exception of probably the U.S. Army and the British Army. U.S. Army and British Army have reasonably good supplies of dry cell batteries, so they have all those small, relatively small mobile radios that are useful with infantry. But everybody else has severe shortages of batteries.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions about the specific makeup of the Soviet tank units. So Scott is asking, I'm assuming that tanks that were supporting infantry had a high number of HE shells.
I don't have the specific loadouts. The Russian accounts generally don't give that. There were standard norms. The Red Army did have norms for what tanks were supposed to bring into battle. And it's true not only in tank units supporting the infantry, it's true even in tank corps. A T-34 and a tank corps will typically have far more HE rounds on board their T-34s than they will AP rounds, because just as with most armies in World War II, the majority of targets for tanks are not other tanks.
Yeah.
Contrary to what you see in War Thunder and World of Tanks, most of the targets are other things. I mean, the Soviets have the same tank doctrine that you'll find in the U.S. Army and in a lot of armies, and that is tank corps are intended for exploitation. They're not out there to fight panzer divisions. They're there once the rifle divisions secure the breakthrough, then you inject the tank corps and the mechanized corps, and they do the exploitation mission. So with the exploitation mission, the expectation is you're going to be fighting enemy infantry and trucks and all sorts of odds and ends, and HE is going to be your most useful ammunition type.
Okay. Thank you. And Terry is saying that Peter Samsonov probably has the HE figures. He was on fairly recently talking about the Tiger tank, so we can invite him back to talk about that. More questions, then we'll bring things to an end. So another one from Scott was about were Soviet tanks used in the indirect fire role? We're back to kind of that definition of tank destroyer and assault gun and artillery piece, but I'm assuming yes is the answer.
Not really. The reason is that the bulk of the armor force that was used to support infantry, in the sense of armor units that were attached to rifle corps, or they were attached to rifle divisions, tended to be that large number of self-propelled artillery units. As often as not, the units that are going to be attached to infantry to do direct support of the infantry units are going to be Su-76s, ISU-122s, ISU-152s. Those are artillery units. And the Su-76 is just like the ZIS-3 76 millimeter gun on which it's based. It's designed to do either direct fire or indirect fire. It's the divisional field gun, so it's designed to do either. The tanks that are assigned to the infantry for support, as often as not, are attached for direct fire. I mean, an IS-2, yes, you can use it, theoretically for indirect fire. The reason you're bringing in an IS-2, in all likelihood, is for direct fire. You probably got some sort of a target like a bunker or something you want to deal with. You're not going to use that one. You're not going to waste the 122 on artillery and direct fire. You've got plenty of other weapons to do that mission. What you bring in an IS-2 for is to deal with specific problems. For example, the Germans had a lot of fortified zones on the Eastern Front. And so the reason that you're going to assign IS-2s to the infantry during those missions is to deal with fortified zones.
Okay, thank you. This is an interesting one. It came in from two different people. What were the Soviets doing with their Lend-Lease tanks by this point of the war?
They were used interchangeably with Sherman. Well, let me back off for a second. There's two primary Lend-Lease tanks in service in the Red Army at this point. There's Sherman tanks, mostly M4A2s, mostly the 75 millimeter, and there's Canadian Valentines. The Shermans were used the same as a T-34. They were used in tank corps, mech corps. Some units had a mixture of T-34s and Shermans. Some units had mostly Shermans. It varies. You have to go to the actual unit histories to see what they had. But they were just used like a T-34 would be used. The Canadian Valentines were used as light tanks. They're used mostly for reconnaissance roles. And the reason that the Valentine was still being requested, there were still conferences where the Allies were talking about, well, what are you going to provide by Lend-Lease? The Red Army kept saying, well, we'd like some more Canadian Valentines. The reason is, as I mentioned before, dealing with the Su-76, the Soviet industry stopped producing light tanks. They stopped producing T-60s and T-70s, but they still needed light tanks as reconnaissance vehicles, and the Canadian Valentine served that function. I remember talking to a buddy of mine over in Warsaw who grew up as a kid in the Warsaw area during these battles, and he remembered at the house he was at the day that the Red Army came through, the unit that came through was a Soviet tank unit equipped with Valentines. And they just came charging through and got shot up by PaK-40s, by German 75 millimeter anti-tank guns. They were defending the town.
Okay, thank you very much. And my last question really is going to be about, I think generally we sometimes kind of ignore the fact that by 1944, the Third Reich, the Germans have got very good at drawing out these long defensive campaigns, retreat a bit, hold a bit, retreat a bit. And I think if you just kind of leap from, I don't know, Stalingrad straight to Bagration or something like that, you kind of omit just how stubborn the Germans are in defense. We think of that cataclysmic failure of not getting to Moscow, but actually they weren't beaten there for nearly 3 years after that, were they? So I think sometimes when we talk about the Soviet losses, we forget how good the Germans were still at that kind of defensive warfare. Is that a fair point?
I think the big failure of the Wehrmacht in 1944 is Hitler's various Festung orders. Yeah. The Germans had been very flexible up through 1944 in defensive battles. Fight as hard as you can, pull back, at the last minute, set up another defensive line, hold as long as you can, pull back. Very stubborn resistance. What happens in the summer of 1944 is Hitler adopts this Festung policy where certain cities and certain locations become classified as fortified cities, Festung, and it's fight there to the last man. And so during Bagration, Vitebsk, Bobruisk, Orsha, the Belarusian capital of Minsk, all are classified as festoon cities. And so that takes away a lot of the Wehrmacht commanders' tactical flexibility. If you can't withdraw at a proper time, if you have to keep begging Berlin, let us withdraw, otherwise we're going to lose everybody. And I would say that that's one reason that Army Group Center is defeated in June, July 1944, whereas they were not defeated in the spring of 1944. The policy adopted by Berlin as to a much more rigid form of defense in the summer of 44 is catastrophic for the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now, I know, folks, we've got more questions that are in the sidebar, but we will leave it there because the longer shows don't do as well in repeat views later on. So I want people to watch this fantastic show. We're back again tomorrow, folks. We're talking about the Battle of the Philippine Seas. We're going off to the Pacific, and then Prit is here in the evening or the afternoon, depending on where you are, to kind of continue this story from his perspective of the strategic kind of overview of Bagration in the center there. So thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much for dealing with all those random questions that were coming in. Thank you for your questions, everybody. Don't forget to click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest books. The links, as I say again, to Steve's book on the tanks is in the description below. So yeah, I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.